You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to episode 24 of Ethnocynology. I'm your host, David Ian Howe, and I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist, and I guess I should say Ethnocynology with David Ian Howe is the name of the podcast. But anyway, regardless, last week we interviewed Dr. William Taylor, who is a horse expert on the evolution of horses and their domestication. This week we are interviewing Cassidee Thornhill, who is the collections manager for the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository. Also a good friend of mine, and she was in my cohort in graduate school. As I stated last time, go back and listen to the first episode if you haven't already, but as I stated last time, this will be the audio-only version of this episode, which will be the extended interview, which you won't get on the YouTube version. The YouTube version I'll probably combine into one long video or two shorter videos just for, retention purposes, and also it's a lot to animate and throw pictures over for the whole full interview. So if you're coming from the YouTube video, once that posts, this will be the full extended interview of both Will and Cassidee. The first one will be Will's full one, but this one will be the full one with Cassidee. Cassidee, I would also say, is an expert on horses, at least in terms of horses in this part of the world. And this is also a fascinating episode as well. Will wrote the book on horses. Cassidee actually analyzed one of the only horses from this period of time that we're talking about that exists. So that's also genuinely cool. As we'll talk about in this episode, Cassidee highlights the Blacks Fork River site, which is also home to this specific horse, and I'll stop yapping about and let her get into. So without further ado, I'll stop yapping. Let me introduce Cassidee.
My name's Cassidee Thornhill. I'm the collections manager for the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository.
So I first asked Cassidee, what was your thesis? I should have remembered this because, she was in my cohort and I went to her defense when she researched this and defended it. But anyway, it was 10 years ago, more than that. I think it was 12 years ago. Cassidee, what was your thesis?
For my thesis, I was doing research into early contact era in Wyoming and particularly looking for evidence of horses.
Then I asked Cassidee here, can you elaborate more on the early contact era with the zooarchaeological evidence for horses in the Americas?
Prior to European arrival, there were no horses, at least not recent horses, domesticated horses. And with their spread and their integration into native lifeways, there were large-scale economic and social changes that occurred. And even if we think about it now, they're really intertwined. You don't really think about plains native peoples without thinking about their horses. But I was interested in how that actually happened and what the processes were and what it looked like.
So her research question, I then asked Cassidee, how'd you do that? How'd you come up with that?
I first wanted to find all of the remains that dated to that period, early contact in Wyoming, and I actually found that there weren't very many to start with. I think total I had 11 sites across the state that had horses in general, and only one dated confidently to this time period.
If you've seen my past several interviews, so one thing I like to do, because I struggle with having mental images in my head, what does this site look like? And I ask that to quite a bit of researchers that I interview. So I have Cassidee here. Can you kind of take me through what the site looks like?
So that's the Blacks Fork River site. It's actually a site that's got a lot of components to it, going all the way from early archaic all the way into late prehistoric and some later historic components. There's a lot of hearths that were excavated out of there. But to me, the most exciting component was the horse. So there was a nearly complete horse skeleton that was buried with 3 coyote skulls, and it was clearly a young horse. And it had really obvious evidence of human modifications, but no other artifacts. And it dated early for this time period.
Another thing I asked Cassidee here too is this a NAGPRA site? Is there a Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act? We've talked about this extensively on ruins in this podcast as well. But if there's a human burial or human funerary context or anything associated with human objects of cultural patrimony or objects, ceremonial objects or funerary items or human remains, it falls under NAGPRA. So I asked Cassidee, does this site in particular?
I don't think so. There's no evidence of human remains, and because of the way it was excavated, it's not clear how it got to be where it was, because it was construction. It was like they were monitoring, and construction equipment for gravel extraction came down right on top of the horse. And so they excavated it, but not like really carefully all the way down through it. So the context for how it got there is kind of unclear.
Okay, and the next thing I asked Cassie too is, she mentioned coyotes. Can you elaborate more on those for the dog people?
We know certainly from oral traditions that coyotes were really significant to most native tribes. Why there were 3 and why there were just the skulls. They were also kind of arranged around the horse skull. It's really unclear, but it's probably some kind of cultural significance.
I then asked Cassidee, can you tell me more about the burial?
Yeah, so it looked like the horse had been disarticulated partially. So parts of it were still anatomically correct, like most of the leg bones were together and most of the ribs were together, but it was kind of clear, and also from the way it was arranged and also from the human modification where they were located, that was partially taken apart and then maybe placed kind of almost in a roundish oval kind of shape with the coyote skulls around the skull.
Like any good academic paper or thesis or project or dissertation, you're going to have methods and materials. And I asked Cassidee here, can you elaborate on that? And what did you test for?
So first I kind of looked at counts of how many horses there were, what they dated to. I kind of tried to explain maybe some theories for why there's not very many of them. I wrote a program to kind of indicate that is less than what we should expect. And then I re-examined the Black's Fork horse to redetermine its age, to kind of examine the modifications to see if it was consumed also partially, or if it was just disarticulated and left. I also did a little bit looking at the coyote skulls again for kind of similar things. I sent off new radiocarbon dates.
Cassie and I took the same coding class in college with in grad school, I should say, with Dr. Todd Saravel. She got way more out of it than I did. It was very confusing to me, and I cannot code. But Cassidee used this for her thesis, and I asked her, can you explain what did you program?
So for the program, I was kind of looking at how quickly horses would spread across Wyoming, how many the state theoretically could hold, and kind of just population dynamics. And then I kind of tried to account for some taphonomic bias for like maybe why things wouldn't get preserved. And then also additionally, it was kind of, this part could definitely be manipulated again because it's kind of unclear, but also maybe how many archaeologists could find, just because, we don't find all archaeological sites, but how many do we actually find? And that kind of gave me a number for just maybe how many we could expect, which isn't very high, but it's more than what we have.
Pretty cool. So now I have Cassidee explain the results of the study.
So for the program, I came up with less than like 5 than what we should expect through that short time period, but we only have 1. And then by looking at the context for that Black's Fork horse, I was kind of exploring that maybe we're only finding horses in certain archaeological context where they could be identified as being archaeological. Most of the time, if you're finding horse remains, you're going to assume that they're modern or recently historic and not archaeological. So I was looking at the instances in which we would recognize them. And it's also probably instances in which people are making more of an impact on that specific horse. They're not kind of being left where they may have passed away. They're being put in certain circumstances. They're either being eaten or they're being buried.
Next, I asked Cassidee, why is it hard to find or identify early horses of this time, or early horses in general?
I think partially because they're misidentified is one of the things. They're of a similar size to a lot of other fauna. Bison and elk could be pretty easily misidentified if you have fragments. And also, I think, they're not being identified as like archaeological excavation or surveys happening, just because you might not think that they're archaeological. And also, I think, the instance like for the Black's Fork horse is that there's obvious cut marks on it, and it was buried with the coyote skulls. There weren't any actual artifacts there, but that's like clear human interfering with the animal's life. And so it makes it much more obvious that it's archaeological.
And some of this was covered in Will's interview and later in the paper with Will that she wrote this about, or wrote this with, I should say. But I asked her, can you elaborate a little more on the horse analysis?
Yeah, so for the Black's Fork horse reanalysis, I was building upon Danny Walker's previous research, and we both confirmed that the horse was very young. It was probably a 5 to 6 month old foal. And then also there's almost 30 different human modifications on it. That includes like cut marks, but also chop marks. So they're much more like violent and like larger modifications than like a cut mark. Also, all of the cut marks and chop marks are made from metal tools. So no stone tools were used in the disarticulation of this horse. Also, from the patterning of where a lot of the modifications are, they're at points of disarticulation and not places where you'd be defleshing. So I was able to determine that it was disarticulated, but little or no meat removal probably occurred.
Why do you think that is?
I think because that wasn't really the goal for what they were doing. I think they disarticulated it, placed it with those coyote skulls, and then left it. I don't think that the goal was trying to consume. There is some stuff from Will's research, though, about there's like other pathologies that we could talk about, too.
Okay. Yeah, what's that?
So in Will's research, continued research that I helped with, we were able to identify that the horse had been injured on its nose. There's like a place where it clearly fractured and then started to heal. That probably could have come from a kick from another horse, or maybe some kind of other accidental injury happened. But the evidence that it started to heal was that it was probably being taken care of. There's also ossification on the back of the skull. And with Will's other research in other areas, that only really occurs when a horse is being held still for long periods of time. You see it on like zebra animals. And then also in Mongolia, he was seeing it on foals that were being tied down so that the mares would stick close by. And so that kind of indicates for the Black's Fork horse that maybe it had been injured, and then they were caring for it for at least a period of time to allow for this kind of bone ossification to happen. And then they decided to cut it up and bury it with the coyote skulls. But it kind of indicates early veterinary care, which is kind of a sophisticated process along domestication. So it kind of indicates that the group that had this horse knew what they were doing and had horses and been taking care of them for a while. So some of the early dating that they did after the horse was excavated, it came back really broad dates, and also really early, like 1400 all the way through to like historic like 1900. So I decided to do a new sample, and the median date came back about 1640. And in Will's research, he sampled it again, and that date came back really similar too. So that kind of just confirms that it's 1640 about for the radiocarbon dating.
Okay, so what surprised you about the results?
They're a little bit early. So prior to this analysis, it was thought that horses didn't arrive in Wyoming until 1700, and that's mostly based off of rock art analysis. But this pushes it back a few decades, which is significant because traditionally it was thought that horses began spreading out of the Southwest colonial Spanish settlements post 1680 Pueblo Revolt. And this clearly dates prior to that comfortably. So there was clearly horses spreading past that that date, and probably through other mechanisms other than the colonialism.
Interviewing Cassidee, I was a little confused, and again, it's been 12 years since I saw her thesis defense, or that I've read it, but I read it last year, I should say, when I interviewed her the first time. This is the second time I interview about this, but the first time it was a mess because of my AV problems. But this interview, I asked her again, is the horse at the Black's Fork site earlier than the Pueblo Revolt?
Spanish settlement had extended up into like the New Mexico region prior to this. And in 1680, there was a revolt of the Pueblo people, and they temporarily expelled the Spanish out of the area. And thus their control over trade goods, including horses, lessened since they weren't present to enforce their laws about interactions with horses and indigenous peoples. So it is at least a few decades prior to the Pueblo Revolt, and that kind of indicates there are some records that groups were stealing horses from these Pueblo settlements and from Spanish colonial settlements, and that probably indicates that they were, stealing these horses and then trading them through indigenous trade routes north to areas like southern Wyoming.
I asked Cassidee, how does this fit into the broader story of horses in the Americas?
So the Black's Fork horse is significant. I'm going to go to a specific tribal examples. So for the spread, it indicates that the spread happened much earlier than we thought and more quickly than we thought. One group that people like to talk about in terms of the spread of horse among plains groups is the Comanche. It was traditionally thought that the ancestral Comanche, which would have been southwestern Wyoming Shoshonean-speaking peoples, that the Comanche groups moved south in order to get horses and then moved on to the southern plains and became what was essentially an empire built on horses and bison. But this Black's Fork horse date indicates that they actually had horses prior to moving. So, and that does line up with some oral accounts and of some rock art accounts that are clearly ancestrally Comanche, but have horses in them featured on the panels. And so they got horses in southwestern Wyoming, probably due to other trading routes, and then they moved south to become the Comanche and to build what was essentially their empire upon horses and bison.
Another thing that, is talked about in the paper with Will and Will's book as well, but especially with this site, is the context of early contact. And that can be Spanish, but also Viking, which I didn't really think about because the Vikings did beat the Spanish here by several centuries, at least I think 5 centuries. So I asked Cassidee, can you elaborate on that here?
So in research with Will, he was looking at genomic studies on horses in North America, both archaeological and modern horses, and looking for ancestral links with European horses, Pleistocene-aged horses, and also Viking horses, because there's evidence of Viking settlements in North America prior to Spanish settlements, but it's not clear whether or not they brought horses this far west to those settlements. And in Will's results, it shows that both archaeological horses in North America and modern samples taken, do not relate very closely to Pleistocene horses or those Viking horses, and only European horses. For the horse genetics and ancestral bloodlines, Will's research, they sampled archaeological horse remains in North America and also modern horses throughout North America. The modern North American horses seem to share more with British horses, and most of the archaeological North American horses share similarities with Spanish breeds of horses. So it kind of shows a temporal shift from mostly Spanish into British colonization and then eventually into American colonization.
And then I asked Cassidee, why does this thesis matter?
Yeah, my thesis ties into kind of larger questions of horse relationships and domestication, in that it does show that spread of horses much more quickly and that tight integration with human-horse relationship. Horses spread much more quickly due to human interaction, and it also shows that people were caring for their horses and that they had that relationship with them, and that significance also can be seen in the way it was buried. With those 3 coyote skulls, there's some kind of importance tied to it, and that's kind of seen throughout most of the world in their domestication and their use in human activities.
And this kind of blew my mind in the interview as well, but I didn't think about that. I guess since Columbus was coming, to the continent just in search of spices and going right back, he didn't need to bring horses. I just kind of assumed that he did. So I asked Cassidee, can you say that here? Did Columbus have horses or not on his first voyage?
Yeah. Because I don't think Columbus had many on his first voyage in 1492. If he did, it was probably very few, because he didn't know what he was coming up on, and I can't imagine Even he did bring some on a second voyage in 1493, but I still even think then it wasn't very many because they're probably not as useful in the Caribbean as they would be in other places.
Yeah. And wrapping up, as I asked Will in his interview, ethnoequinopology. What are some examples of like horses in human cultural contexts?
Oh, one thing that I thought Will actually, he kind of mentioned like sovereignty in these horse groups. So one thing that is really fascinating about horses spreading to various parts of the world is that certain groups take to them very significantly. And a lot of these groups, it actually kind of prolongs the colonization process. It kind of, having the horse kind of gives them a way to fight back for a little bit longer. Yeah, so particularly for plains groups, I'm going to talk about because that's what I know the most about, is that with horses coming in and being integrated so closely into their lifeways, it allows for them to prolong that colonization from American colonialism. As people are coming from the east and spreading, the native people have a way to escape, but also to engage more effectively in battle against the U.S. Army with those horses. And that whole process, it just takes much longer than it would have otherwise. And that can be seen in other places too. I think that's part of what Will was talking about in South America. Those regions, it took a lot longer for colonialism to sink in, and then in South Africa, and then parts of Australia.
And lastly, I know Cassidee very well. She's a great friend of mine. I know she loves horses, dogs, and cats. She has all three. I believe she had a horse when she was younger, but I know she has a dog and a cat. So I ask her, as I would ask anybody I interview, are horses or dogs more important for human history? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I love dogs, so that's really hard, but I think horses probably in human history. When we think about the big events that happen in world history, horses are really integral to that. They're integral in the spread of ideas and goods, trade goods, material goods, and also in warfare. We think about a lot of those larger civilizations spread across parts of the world, and horses were really integral to that spread. They might not have been able to spread as quickly or as vastly as they did. Yeah. So I think horses, kind of undeniably have to have a bigger place in history. Perfect. I think in like personal relationships, maybe dogs more, but.
And that concludes episode 24 of Ethnocynology. If you have questions for Cassidee and also Will from the previous episode, leave them, on Spotify or shoot me an email. David@davidianhowe.com, or you can shoot those to producer@davidianhowe.com as well. That would be my email for this podcast. But also, if you want to wait for the YouTube video to pop up, you can put them on the YouTube comments there too. But if you email me with some questions before this comes out on YouTube, which this episode should air the 25th, so this should air the 27th. If you can get this out, if you can email me any questions you might have for the two of them by the end of the month, which is September now, get back to me with any questions you have, and I'll make sure to add those into the YouTube video and try to address those at the end, and I can reach out to both of them as well. I have both their numbers, and it's an easy text to send. So thank you very much for listening. If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast, please do. That not only helps me, but also helps the entire APN, which is the Archaeology Podcast Network. There are tons of episodes backlogged on the Archaeology Podcast Network of podcasts that no longer are in production, but also many more that are in production. You can look up any topic you want basically on the website and you can find it. And there's many of other great podcasts on there to listen to that are archaeology and anthropology adjacent, whether that be academic or CRM or anything else. So yeah, please check those out. And again, thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, just shoot me an email at david@davidianhowe.com. And yeah, that's it. Thank you again to Cassidee, and thank you again to Will. I appreciate it.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.